Okay, I want to welcome everybody to today's Political Concepts Conference. As most of you know, the Political Concepts Initiative is a multi-university collaboration which includes scholars from Brown, Columbia, NYU, CUNY, and the New School. And it's sponsored here at Brown by the Kogut Institute for the Humanities. I'm Amanda Anderson, the director. And the initiative is led by Adi Ophir, who is visiting professor of the humanities here at the Institute. And it's actually organized by a committee which includes Adi, who's the boss, and which, as the others will attest, and Tim Buse and Leela Gandhi. So the Political Concepts Initiative has proven to be a really interesting, frame-shifting, generative way of doing political theory across a range of disciplines and within a plurality of political commitments. And as I think, as you can see at a glance from the program, or if you've explored the website or the schedules of prior conferences, the project aims to revise key concepts in contemporary political discourse and to introduce new concepts for understanding a rapidly changing global reality, and a newly terrifying one in today's context. It's associated with a peer review online journal, politicalconcepts.org, where the papers delivered at the conferences are published. And by remaining open to what might count as a political concept and how its meaning and relevance and energies and effects might be described and engaged, the Political Concepts Project remains an engaged and adaptive model of scholarly endeavor. And at Brown and elsewhere, it's drawing scholars from across the humanities and the social sciences. There is also now, from Fordham, a partnership with Political Concepts, which is now publishing in book form some of the papers from various conferences. So the first edition has just come out, and I encourage all of you, I'm going to pass this around the table when I'm done with this introduction, but also Adi has some extra copies which he will sell to you for like a really good price. So you can see him, there's not that, I mean, they're going really fast. They're going like hotcakes, right? Yeah. Okay. There's another one in the works that is based on last year's conference called the Balibar edition. And if I were Etienne Balibar, I would be really mad that there was a conference today called the Trump edition. I'd be like friggin' furious. But anyway, because you can think with Balibar. Okay, I've told Adi this, but like, as I said, he's bossy. Okay, so I want to thank, the other thing, I did want to actually read a little something from the introduction of this, because I thought it was kind of interesting, and it kind of captures what's behind political concepts. So here we go. This effort to redefine fundamental concepts of political thinking, to invent new uses for existing concepts, or to introduce new concepts into circulation, whether through import or innovation, seeks to transform the scholarly discourse and the scholarly writing of the humanities and social sciences. The driving force behind this effort is a distress and a demand stemming from a standard political theory that neither tries nor seems capable of dealing with the deep transformation of the human condition and emergent practices that mark our time. Nor does it engage the demands that existing conceptual practices exert upon us. Common political discourse, that is, politics as represented via most forms of media, seems only to dwindle our reflection on the human condition, encouraging epistemic blindness and emotional distance, if not outright alienation. The intellectual resources suggested by the various strands of critical theory are also no longer satisfactory. Contributors to this lexicon share in an effort to address a contemporary demand, not merely for a renewal of political theory, but for a new vocabulary with which to speak about the political. So no pressure on our speakers. and are there any political theorists here who are mad? Okay. All right. I also want to thank Adi especially, along with the Brown co-organizers this year, Tim Buse and Leela Gandhi, and also Bonnie Honig, who has been a major player in political concepts over the past few years, for the work they've done not only in setting up this conference and other conferences, but for their efforts in generating sustained forms of intellectual conversation around this important project, including a monthly reading group here at Brown, which I think has been really important for the faculty. I also want to thank them for always inviting Brown colleagues to participate in these conferences, because I think that puts us all in conversation with one another, and there are lots of institutions where this pretty much never happens, and I'm thrilled that this sort of event is taking place here at the Kogut Institute. So that's what I want to say, and then we're just going to move immediately into the first panel. So we will have 2 papers and then a discussion, which will be around 30 minutes afterwards. We may go a little past the time indicated on your schedule because we have a little leeway today because of a speaker absence later. And we also got started a little bit late. So introductions are going to be rather minimal. I think that most people here are quite well known, but we will honor the convention and provide some introduction. So it's a great honor to moderate our first panel. Joan Scott, who is Professor Emerita of Intellectual and Cultural History at the Institute for Advanced...
Where did you get that? It's of social science.
Sorry, it says right under social science, that.
It isn't true.
Okay, I'm sorry. So correct me.
I don't know.
Of social science.
Yeah.
That's it. Okay, of social science. At the Institute for Advanced Study, is one of the most important theorists of historical practice in recent times, and she's known for her many lucid and groundbreaking books on the vexed role of gender in relation to universalizing forces of democratic politics. Her most recent book is Sex and Secularism, published in 2017. She was the founding director of the Pembroke Center here at Brown and served in that role from 1981 to 1985. She also held the Nancy Duke Lewis Chair here. The second speaker, Zahid Shahari, specializes in postcolonial studies, visual culture, and critical theory. His book, After Image of Empire, Photography in 19th Century India, published in 2012, provides a historical and philosophical account of early photography in India, analyzing how aesthetic experiments in colonial photographic practice shed light on the changing nature of perception and notions of truth, memory, and embodiment. His current book project, Impunity, Notes on a Global Tendency, analyzes juridical, economic, political, and aesthetic aspects of the practices of impunity from the Cold War to the present, from post-colonial states to the United States. Joan Scott's concept that she will be speaking on is Trump, and Zahid's is impunity. We'll start with Joan.
Do it from here? Where do you want? Right, okay, I just have no idea. Okay, great, thank you. Okay, is this okay? Okay. So when Amanda just said that Balibar must be upset about about you guys thinking with Balibar last year, I think what we're doing is thinking against Trump. So that's how I thought of this topic or this concept that I picked. So the paper is actually called Trumpism, Trompe l'œil. Is Trump a political concept in the sense that Adi Ophir has defined it as a unit of mental representation, a linguistic performance that, and I'm quoting, tries to explain, to present, and to express the essence of what the concept refers to? Is it Pace Koselleck, more than a word? Koselleck writes, quote, "In use, a word can be unambiguous. By contrast, a concept must remain ambiguous in order to be a concept." Until recently, Trump was just another word, a noun and a verb, whose definitions long antedated its current avatar. It was not even one of those keywords in a collective lexicon that Raymond Williams said distinguished vocabulary from mere words. It's only since the candidacy and then the election of Donald Trump that the word Trump has acquired the status of vocabulary in Williams' sense. I don't think it's a concept. The coining of the word Trumpism seems a better attempt to articulate something we might recognize as a political concept. To cite Koselleck again, social and political concepts, quote, are recurrently emerging neologisms reacting to specific social or political circumstances that attempt to register the novelty of such circumstances. And novelty, I think, is the key thing there. Trumpism has fast entered current discourse across the political ideological spectrum. It's more than just a way of referring to the Trump brand, which has been carefully marketed and gold-plated over the years. The term Trumpism headlines articles from The Nation to The Atlantic to the National Review, and it's invoked in serious analyses and satirical remarks. Attempts to define the phenomenon are legion, most prominently in discussions of populism. In these discussions, Trumpism is taken to be neither exactly like the reign of Juan Perón in Argentina, nor of the Venezuelan Hugo Chavez, nor for that matter of the Italian and German fascists. Coining the term with the leader's name suggests the existence of distinctive characteristics that warrant explicit denotation. Trumpism has already acquired a currency that Trump does not have. It tries to make sense of the man's incoherence as a political ideological formation, but it may only be the name for this moment in our history. In this paper, I want to explore both Trump and Trumpism. They are connected in intriguing ways, not least because the definitional history of the word Trump is so uncannily embodied in the man whose grandfather is said to have chosen it as an alternative to the German Drumpf upon arrival in the United States. Did Friedrich Drumpf understand the power of the word he chose as his family name? Was there something in the word itself that enabled his grandson to actualize so many of its definitions? And what are we to make of the fact that among his many supporters, Trump's name has become synonymous only with rich and success, leaving aside the many other apt and more negative characterizations that fill the pages of our dictionaries? What about Trump, the word, can help us understand Trumpism, the effort to name a politics? So first, Trump. In early English usage, and still today, a primary definition comes from card games, in which for the duration of the game, one suit is arbitrarily chosen to outrank all the others. The Trump game wins the trick. Possessing it assures a winning advantage. It can always take the card of another suit. My friend Sarv, the psychic, tells me that in the tarot deck, the Trump cards, and this is from him, are those that have stronger bearing upon the others. They are the dominant cards against whose power there is no appeal. The power of the Trump card leads to the word's association with triumph and to its metaphorical uses. A Trump card is the move one party can use to attain decisive victory. In this sense, a Trump card can be a person, weapon, or the starting of a chain of events. The Trump card, and I'm just reading a series of quotes to you, is a key resource to be used at an opportune moment. It is the clincher that seals the deal. Although Trump can refer to a reliable or admirable person, and to turn up trumps means to turn out well or successful, the word more often has connotations of deception and cheating. Trumped up are those false charges used to impugn someone's integrity or throw obstacles in the way of his career. They are forgeries, fabrications, and inventions devised for unscrupulous ends. The OED cites an example of how this meaning is expressed, quote, "You have trumped up a cock and bull story." I think this usage may have to do with the fact that in card games, Trump suits are arbitrarily designated, and they're used to win tricks. There's a short metonymic slippage from this kind of ungrounded invention, the arbitrary designation of the Trump suit, to dishonest fabrication, trickery. Trump also derives from the musical instrument, the trumpet, and the trumpet itself from the fact that it is a tube. The trumpet connection has to do with sound. To trump is to blow the horn, to issue a loud summons, a resounding call, or a celebrational proclamation. A trumpeter was sometimes likened in popular parlance to a braying ass. In slang, Trump refers to, quote, "the act of breaking wind audibly," or as the concise New Partridge Dictionary of Slang and Unconventional Usage puts it less euphemistically, to farting. John Oliver seems to have known or intuited this when he referred to the countenance of Trump, the candidate, as smiling but gassy. The distasteful odor associated with this impolite sound attaches to the word's deceptive connotations. The past tense of Trump is sometimes rendered not as trumped, but as trumpeted, one of whose definitions is to have greatly extolled or boasted in exaggerated ways. Quote, "Some of the most trumpeted of names," one wag noted in 1908, "are authors of no consequence." In these meanings, blowing the trumpet has nothing to do with the pleasures of music. It is simply the expulsion of hot air. One dictionary explains the origins of this usage as, quote, "alluding to quacks and mountebanks who attracted the public by blowing a horn and then cheated them into buying shoddy goods." Hence, trumpery as showy but worthless finery, something of less value than it seems. All that gold plate covering over the junk underneath. The English comes from the French. Tromper, to blow the trumpet, also meant to act the fool. But the word has more negative connotations than that. It may be that cheating death, trompe la mort, has something admirable about it, but there's little else to redeem the word. In French, trump is essentially a negative term. Tromper, to trump, means to lie, to dissimulate, to seduce, to cheat, to betray as a lover or a spouse, to promote false ideas with the intent of provoking errors of judgment, to abuse the ignorance or trust of another. It is more shameful, the editors of Diderot's encyclopedia wrote, to tromper, than to be trumped, d'être trompé. Trumpery is the art of deception, fraud, and mystification. The trompeur or trompeuse is a hypocrite, perfidious, never to be trusted. English has taken much of this into our own language, but perhaps the term of choice for thinking trump the word and trompe the man today is the one we use in its original French, trompe l'œil. This refers to an artifice, originally visual, but extended metaphorically to mean anything that creates an appearance of reality. Trompe l'œil deliberately creates an illusion, a misperception, that is not confined to aesthetic practice. It's also synonymous with delusion, leurre, a false belief that is tenaciously held even if contradicted. Artifice is the name of Trump's game. Donald Trump is the original mountebank, a purveyor of shoddy goods, presenting himself as truly independent, unafraid to speak his mind. He tells it like it is, his followers say, admiringly, even about his lies. His similarity to the Wizard of Oz has not escaped commentators. Trump is the carnival huckster, reinvented as a virtual reality television celebrity, who, like the Wizard of Oz, requires the residents of his Emerald City to wear green glasses. Everything is money-colored in his world. But as the Scarecrow soon discovers, he is nothing but humbug. Humbug, my friend Byron Connolly reminds me, was also the self-characterization of P.T. Barnum, who embraced artifice as a winning sales strategy long before the advent of Madison Avenue. Kevin Young has recently noted the racialized aspect of 19th century hoaxes in his new book, Bunk, The Rise of Hoaxes, Humbug, Plagiarists, Phonies, Post-Facts, and Fake News. Philip Roth and Ariel Dorfman, commenting on Trump, also point us to Melville's The Confidence Man, written in 1857. Says Roth, Trump is just a con artist. The relevant book about Trump's American forebear is Henry Melville's The Confidence Man. The darkly pessimistic, daringly inventive novel, Melville's Last, that could just as well have been called The Art of the Scam. Dorfman tells us that the novel's subtitle, His Masquerade, is also important to take into account. Quote, "The passengers of that boat are systematically built by a devilish protagonist who constantly shifts his identity, changing names and shapes and schemes, among them real estate deals and bankruptcies, spurious lies disguised as moralistic truths, financial hustles and deceptions." Like Trump, Dorfman adds, citing Melville, the confidence man exercises on his dupes, quote, "the power of persuasive fascination, the power of holding another creature by the button of the eye." Trump offers his exaggerated wealth as proof of his incorruptibility as well as of his reliability. He will bring the skills of a successful businessman, he and his supporters tell us, to the running of the nation. Politics is, after all, according to him, the art of the deal. And it's the art, the artifice, that makes the deal. He who plays the Trump card wins the trick. That the Trump brand touts success and confidence, the assurance of quality and stability in defiance of the actual record of his businesses and behavior, is the trompe-l'œil this man manages to pull off. Melville's metaphor, holding another creature by the button of the eye, is a good translation of the French term. Trump's cunning deception probably would have worked for a similar type given the circumstances, even if he had a different name. But the uncanny incarnation of the word in the man makes it all the more intriguing to think about. Would there be Trump, capital T, or for that matter, Trumpism without Trump, lowercase? Or to put it differently, without the artifice that is Trump, the verb, would there be Trump, the Donald, or for that matter, Trumpism, the perhaps futile attempt to find some reality behind the operations of artifice and deception? The second part is called Trumpism. If political concepts are attempts at explanation and understanding, what does the coining of Trumpism by political commentators attempt to do? It wants to suggest novelty, an unprecedented development in the history not only of our nation but of the world. But what is new about Trumpism? In the online Wiktionary, Trumpism is defined tautologically as the philosophy and politics espoused by Donald Trump. But two historians note that Trump, the man, has neither a political philosophy nor an ideology. One of these, a historian of American populism, says that Trump lacks a relatively coherent definition of the people he claims to represent. This in contrast to past American populist movements, especially the People's Party of the 1890s, that have understood the people to be workers, farmers, or the common man, concrete reference for the general term. Although Trump has insisted that he speaks in the name of the people, some commentators dismiss the claim. Where populist leaders claim to be the vox populi, writes one, Trump is the voice of Trump. Yet, replies another scholar, there's nothing new here. He sees Trump's authoritarian democracy as characteristic of the post-1945 reformulation of fascism. Quote, radical narcissism, charismatic messianism, and mythical thinking often appear in the history of populism as essentially attached to racism, nativism, and xenophobia. Whether he started out that way or not, this scholar concludes, Trump became the name of America's populist right. In this vein, Frank Rich suggests that Trumpism predates Trump, points to the 1968 presidential campaign of George Wallace as its most recent earlier expression. Toxic anger defines Trumpism, Rich writes. It is a rage at America's cultural and economic elites in both political parties as well as at minorities and immigrants. This toxic anger, Rich says, has steadily informed a movement that has been more or less visible, but nonetheless extremely resilient over the years. The movement achieved a name with the successful chapter of the presidency in 2016 of Donald Trump. Trumpism, for these writers, is a way of describing the current president as a populist, locating him as the heir to a long tradition of nativist, nationalist, and racist zealots. We can think here of Richard Hofstadter's Anti-Intellectualism in American Life, or of his The Paranoid Style in American Politics, or of Michael Rogan's discussions of American political demonology in Ronald Reagan, the movie. Trump's performances fit the descriptive definitions cataloged in a compelling article by Gene Komaroff, written in 2011, before the advent of Trump. And this, again, I'm just sort of pulling things from her description. A charismatic leader, a resurrected patriarch, his rhetorical appeals are anti-elitist and anti-establishment. He's the primal father who will restore order in a chaotic world. The leader who, in Max Weber's terms, emerges, quote, in times of distress, and who has been neither office holder nor incumbent of an occupation. Charismatic leaders, says Weber, are men who have not acquired expert knowledge. They have specific gifts of body and spirit, gifts that are not accessible to everybody. Their appeals express strident rage and uncivil rants, again, this is Komaroff, marked by emotive dualisms and radical reductionism. Coherence is not a test of their power lies in themselves. Trump insists in typical demagogic fashion that his lies are self-evident truths, and he provokes a populist energy in his followers that lacks any social consciousness or social responsibility. In office, he and his followers have set about dismantling what Rich calls the constitutional and legal guardrails of American political institutions. His xenophobia and white supremacy put him in the ranks of the worst representatives of the right-wing populist genre. Although the historian Federico Finkelstein argues that Trumpism is a form of post-fascist politics, We don't have to look beyond Richard Spencer and the specter of Charlottesville to find the rekindling of that discredited past among his acolytes. So is Trumpism then just a new name for an old formation? Why then the new name? Here I want to follow the lead of the journalist Adam Schatz, who refers to Trump as, quote, a grotesque symptom of a national malaise, and of Stuart Hall, who, contemplating Thatcherism in the 1980s, remarked that, quote, the swing to the right is not a reflection of the crisis, it is itself a response to the crisis. The coining of the term Trumpism, I want to argue, is at once a symptom of and a response to the crisis that neoliberalism has produced in this moment for democratic politics. It's not that there aren't distinguishing features of the Trump era that we could say constitute Trumpism, but the term is most often used as a way of locating the crisis squarely in the practices of the current administration, as if the alternative of, say, Hillary Clinton would have provided the needed resolution. Ta-Nehisi Coates points out that much of the analysis of Trump, he doesn't use the word Trumpism, avoids the fact that he is an overt exponent of the ideology of white supremacy, an outlook that has deep roots in American history. While Trump's white predecessors were undoubtedly also racists, Coates concedes, they, quote, made their way to high office through the passive power of whiteness. Trump has made that awful inheritance explicit, enabled by white backlash against the Obama presidency. That is the sense in which he is, Coates says, the first white president. Coates finds that other explanations for his success, populism, white working class economic insecurity, are distractions from the central issue of racism, attempts to displace or deny the problem. White tribalism, he writes, haunts even the writings of such liberal journalists as Nicholas Kristof and George Packer. I want to extend this argument to suggest that much of the analysis of Trumpism, indeed the formulation of the concept itself, is a way of denying the neoliberalism that so thoroughly saturates American society, the Democratic Party and beyond. The neoliberalism that at every level, political, economic, cultural, has for long years eroded American democracy across most of the political spectrum. Trumpism suggests novelty, even as some commentators point to continuity. But even the continuity is with exceptional moments like populism, not the mainstream of American history. Trumpism suggests a newly identified malignancy that sets it apart from the business as usual of politics, politics sold to the highest bidder, from the undermining of community by selfish individualism, from the degrading effects of global capital on humans and the environment. Wendy Brown is perhaps the best diagnostician for the crisis neoliberalism has posed for democracy. Global capital has become sovereign, she writes. It is both, quote, master and coin of the realm, except there is no realm, no global polity, governance, or society, and neither are there boundaries or territory that delimit capital's domain. In other words, it's another kind of artifice. Even as market values have permeated national political life, states are asked to protect, and again, Wendy, national populations against the ravaging effects of open markets on everything, including the national sovereignty, the national imaginary. Xenophobic nationalism, build the wall, is the fantasized response to denationalized economic life, but it is more symptom than cure. Neoliberal rationality has already subverted its goals, having had, quote, a corrosive effect on the rule of law, substituting entrepreneurial criteria for the supremacy of law and every other supervenient moral authority. In other words, there's no possibility of return to the political autonomy of the sovereign nation state. What is deemed Trumpism is at once the embodiment of the neoliberal rationality that has generated the crisis and the nativist response to it, a response that is itself informed by neoliberal rationality. Make America Great Again reconceptualizes the nation as a firm governed not by hallowed constitutional principles, but by the art of the deal, the trickster's game in which deception substitutes for diplomacy and crime sometimes pays off. Brown points out that inside the market model, the criminal is, quote, a rational economic individual who invests, expects a certain profit, and risks making a loss. Kevin Williamson, writing in the National Review, suggests that we watch again the film of David Mamet's Glengarry Glen Ross. And those of you who haven't seen it or have once seen it, I recommend it highly. to get a glimpse of Trump's handbook, not only for the sustained vulgarity of the real estate developers who are the actors in that film, but also for the rules of the game. Become the alpha male by impersonating him. Weave webs of illusion that appeal to a buyer's unconscious desire. Fake it till you make it. One version or another of trompe-l'oeil in its shoddiest form. Williams' piece is called The Death of a Effing Salesman. Its subtitle is Donald Trump Can't Close the Deal, by which he means that Trump is ultimately impotent. And it's interesting to note here that Roget's thesaurus lists impotence as one of the antonyms of Trump. Closing the deal in the Mamet play, as in Trump's rhetoric, is about heterosexual consummation, the orgasmic pleasure of holding the winning hand. Mamet's characters say it clearly, and these are all quotes from the movie. It takes brass balls to sell real estate. If you don't close, you're a fucking faggot, or worse, a cunt. You can't play in the man's game. The play demonstrates the futile attempt to call upon the instrumental power of masculinity to close the deal, because that very masculinity can be achieved only by the completed deal, and the deal itself is always a scam. I take Williamson to mean that Trump's displays of virility, all those blonde trumpettes in his corner, are just an empty come-on, because he cannot ultimately solve the economic problems that infuriate some of his base. Unlike the early moves of Juan Perón or Hugo Chavez, there's no attempt to lessen social inequality, for example. In fact, Trump's policies will only increase the gap between rich and poor. The anti-politics he champions, drain the swamp, will eventually reveal itself to be a new form of authoritarianism, democratic only because he holds an elected office, hence the importance of his insistence on the false claim that he won the popular vote, but otherwise not at all representative. The president as the Wizard of Oz, management of the realm in the hands not even of neutral technocratic elites, but of ideologues in the service of global capital. The undoing of the demos, in reality the fruit of neoliberalism, reconceived as the fulfillment of the white American dream. If there's something we might call Trumpism, it has to do, above all, I think, with the performative style of the man. He's not an ordinary president. That he is an acceptable form of political engagement can only be understood as an effect of reality television. Here, I'm anxious about what Lynn is going to say. Because if we're talking about Trumpism as the creature of its historical moment, the effects of commercial media, television, the internet, cannot be underestimated. Not simply as ways of magnifying its impact, but of actually creating the phenomenon itself. Here's where I want to return to trompe-l'oeil as part of my effort to think Trumpism as something whose meaning rests on a set of illusions, whose manipulation put masters of that art, like P.T. Barnum, to shame. Emily Nussbaum, the New Yorker's TV critic, put it aptly last summer, quote, "It's become a wearying, ugly observation, a media truism at once superficial and deep. If The Apprentice didn't get Trump elected, it is surely what made him electable." Over 14 seasons, the television producer Mark Burnett helped turn the Donald Trump of the late 90s, the disgraced huckster who had trashed Atlantic City, a tabloid pariah to whom no bank would lend, into a titan of industry, nationally admired for being, in his own words, the highest quality brand, end of quote. Trump is nothing more than the exemplar of the neoliberal American dream. I'm sorry, I lost my place. Trump is nothing more than the exemplar of the neoliberal American dream. You'd cash in if you stuck with him. The theme song of the show was For the Love of Money by the OJs. Talk about cash money, dollar bills you all, for all that lean, 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 mean, green, almighty dollar. The Apprentice is set in a patriotic world of capitalist potential. Winners choose which Trump property they can help manage. The episodes never call Trump's judgment into question, writes Nussbaum, again, quote, "All scandal and debate are erased. Trump's combative streak is alchemized into daddy's tough love. He's a family man and a business genius. Frequently he narrates from a helicopter, hovering like Zeus." When The Celebrity Apprentice replaced the original show in 2007, Nussbaum writes, Trump also became a philanthropist. Corporate brands got associated with charity, providing a veneer for what were often failing companies or those fined millions for deceptive business practices. Concealed behind a screen, the Wizard of Oz projected a scary, fantastic image, a huge disembodied head surrounded by fire. In contrast, Trump appears on screen as a lifelike depiction of himself. The reality effect is seemingly undeniable. You see what you get, or is it you get what you see? As they watch the show from season to season, I want to argue, viewers became desiring subjects of the Trump brand. It's not just rage that moved them, but the wish to identify with his evident success and the success of those he deemed winners. Losers, one of his favorite insults, don't know how to play the game. Winners hold the Trump card. It isn't far from that identification to casting the vote for him in 2016. Choosing him somehow meant his choosing you, like a winner on The Apprentice. The appeal to rage was later an instrumentalized populist supplement to the image of the feisty business genius who, like all geniuses, was entitled to his eccentricities and excesses, gold, women, fancy suits, silly hair, long ties. The rage singled out enemies, domestic and foreign, as the cause of disappointment and decline. Mexican rapists and drug dealers, Muslim immigrant terrorists, feminists, gays, lesbians, trans, Democrats with a small and big D, Hillary Clinton, elites, academics, the politically correct, and especially African Americans, with Barack Obama at the head of the list. I think Coates is right that Trump drew primarily on the long history of racism, his own as well as the nation's. White supremacy was the explicit theme of his campaign. The list of enemies grew longer as the ability to manage the presidential reality show weakened. Various stunts were revealed for what they were, stacks of empty folders said to be financial disclosures, accusatory tweets that turned out to be based on sheer ignorance or at least false information. Nussbaum says, more hopefully than realistically, that Trump could no longer control how these stunts played on TV. Well, not all TV, nor all of Twitterdom or the internet. There are still large and influential spaces where the illusion lives on, displacing, as illusions do, the problems wrought by global capital onto others who are not perpetrators, but also the dispossessed victims of what Wendy Brown referred to as the ravaging effects of open markets on everything. If Trump is a political concept, it has to attribute a distinctive meaning to the Trump presidency. It doesn't precede him, though it draws on, indeed has been produced by, long-standing resentments and conflicts of class, race, and gender in American society. Its success rests, too, ironically, on the artifice of the Electoral College, an elitist institution designed to prevent a populist victory. It employs tactics known to others of his type, especially the misidentification of the source of the problems it purports to solve. Trompe-l'œil is not an invention of this politician, although it carries his name. But its use is distinctive in his case. What is novel, and so warrants a special designation, is the explicit deployment of all the tricks of artifice, all the tromperie, for the advancement of neoliberal ideology. Making America great again is not about nostalgia for some lost idol of rural, or for that matter, urban or suburban harmony. It's not about restoring corrupted principles of liberty and justice. It's not even Steve Bannon's impossible dream of reclaiming national sovereignty. Rather, the word again is meant to signal success, measured by high ratings of audience approval, not in the same form as in the past, there's no narrative continuity offered here, but as an extension of Trump's present economic prosperity to future generations. In this scenario, there will be undoubtedly winners and losers. The winners will have earned their fortune. The losers will deserve to lose. Those who choose Trump think they are guaranteed a win. It is, after all, they who hold the Trump card. And right now, I would say for the Republican Congress, he is that card as well. Those of us driven to despair by the appearance of this new historical phenomenon need to think about how the fraud will be unmasked, how the green glasses of Trumpism will be replaced by a vision of a collective commitment to the common good, indeed whether the damage done will have been too great to remedy. But in the meantime, we might take some very small comfort in the fact that the dominant card holds its power only until the next hand is dealt. Thank you.
So I think there'll be a lot of resonances with what Joan was just talking about. impunity has a way of being about Trump. So on January 23rd, 2016, Trump declaimed at a rally in Sioux Center, Iowa. He said, "I could stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody, and I wouldn't lose voters." This statement, and it's hard to tell whether the statement is an exaggeration or maybe it's not an exaggeration given the period we're in. The statement is outside of the bounds of the true and false. And that's so because it's a performative, enacting, among other things, a masculinist will to power, one that anticipates a whole field of sovereign exemptions. The statement's defiance relies on the libidinal mass appeal Trump already enjoyed and that Jones just talked about. When the country would find out about the sexual assaults Trump had boasted about on a recording and additional assaults came to light, it did not seem to matter. In assuming impunity at this rally, he delivered the frisson his rally audiences craved. The statement about shooting someone on Fifth Avenue, however crude, relies on a set of cultural, political, and economic realities that are anything but simple. Unlike Hillary Clinton, whose every misstep seemed to stick to her and freight her campaign, we learned that Trump could actually flout any standard at all and still triumph. The fact that his very name, as we just heard, is a synonym for triumph makes the grand guignol spectacle of contemporary American statecraft seem the result of a threatening fate, perhaps the result of a terror game. I was particularly attuned to Trump's shocking statement because I've been at work, as you heard, on a book about impunity that examines a series of post-colonial sites and global crises through the era of decolonization. And I'm going to start with the OED here for thinking about impunity, as good a place as any to start. And in the OED, there are two related meanings of this word. One, exemption from punishment or penalty. And two, in a weaker sense, this is from the OED, in a weaker sense, exemption from injury or loss as a consequence of any action, security. To have impunity means, if one follows its root definition, to enjoy a double exemption, to be placed outside the purview of punishment and into a sphere of security radically free of other consequences. Trump's statement reveals another aspect of impunity somewhat buried in the OED definition, and that's the fact that impunity can also be a promissory note for violence. As a concept, impunity gets at the heart of problematics concerning the social contract, the state of nature, and an agent's claims on the legitimacy of its violence. And I'm saying here agent's claim on the legitimacy of its violence because I'm not just talking about state violence, but other kinds of agents as well. It is an urgent problematic, impunity, for an era in which political leaders can start wars across the world with spurious justification, and police forces are given a free hand with violence on minority subjects. So in the rest of my remarks today, I'm going to flesh out a little bit about how the term impunity circulates within legal discourse, legal studies. And then I'm going to shift to actually a reading of Derrida's classic essay, Force of Law, and try to read the concept of impunity through that essay. And then I circle back at the end of my remarks back to Trump and to the contemporary moment. Given the abundance of practices of impunity, it is surprising how rarely the concept is actually taken up in social theory, or rather it's not taken up directly. Law is perhaps the only field with a robust and varied dialogue on impunity, and political scientists broach the problem now and again in their discussions of the aftermaths of genocides. To some extent, this is perfectly understandable, since impunity as a concept conjures the juridical. In legal parlance, the classic definition of the concept comes from French lawyer Louis Joinet. He's the author of the 1997 Principles Against Impunity in the Office of the United Nations High Commission for Human Rights. So these principles came to be known as the Joinet Principles, and they define impunity as, and I quote, the impossibility, de jure or de facto, of bringing the perpetrators of human rights violations to account, whether in criminal, civil, administrative, or disciplinary proceedings, since they are not subject to any inquiry that might lead them to being accused, arrested, tried, and if found guilty, convicted, end quote. So surely conceived of in this way, as a question for human rights, impunity is something one ought to be against. And well before the Joannet principles were codified at the UN, Cold War movements, social movements in Latin America explicitly invoked impunidad in their opposition to unchecked sovereign power. And this dovetails with contemporaneous legal scholarship around impunity, which understandably argues for anti-impunity stances. More recently, however, within legal studies, scholars seem divided about being against impunity. Since being against impunity in any categorical way has raised multiple problems, according to these scholars, and these are some of these problems, legal efforts to battle impunity assume that criminal law can solve the problems of impunity without examining the notion of punishment itself, or the possibility that anti-impunity measures widen the scope of pernicious forms of criminal law. Some critics find anti-impunity measures to be either inefficacious or selectively applied, with specific violent acts claiming greater attention than systemic forms of everyday violence. While the legal discourse on impunity and anti-impunity is vital, it necessarily has to assume a juridical judgment as a possible solution, and the juridical seen as the only efficacious one. Impunity has sometimes been legally granted, and certainly legally fought, but most often it is practiced without legal attention of any kind, as an everyday practice that's not restricted only to terrible or exceptional historical times. How to attend to aspects of the practices of impunity that exceed the juridical space. And this is what I'm most interested in, is that how is it that we can think about impunity as an extra juridical concept? To be clear, when I speak of practices of impunity that exceed the space of the juridical, I'm not referring to states of exception or suspension of the law. So I find Agamben less helpful, for example, for thinking about impunity. So in states of exception and suspension of the law, these are moments when the law can be glimpsed in its elemental violence. In fact, I take it as a given that in states of emergency, impunity reigns. Instead, I'm actually more interested in the impunity that adheres to the operations of the law itself, either as its secret, unnamed sharer, or extra-juridical forms of impunity that are outside of the purview of formal juridical attention. So these include instances as diverse as Cold War catastrophes. These are some of the things I'm writing about. Cold War catastrophes such as the genocide in Indonesia, a contemporary development project in Pakistan that entails the destruction of feudally regulated villages in Balochistan, the massacre of Muslims in Gujarat secured by the very agents of the law charged with protecting the citizenry, and police brutality in the United States. At stake in each instance is the differentiation of the social fields, the minoritization of a population subject either to some doctrine concerning objective necessity, and sometimes this can be economic necessity. Wendy Brown writes about this in Undoing the Demos, that demands bloodletting on their part, on the part of the minoritized population or the population indifference, or that enacts the brutalization of this population through the very laws intended to secure their freedom. To think impunity outside of the strictly juridical domain means to make way for understanding its multiple dimensions, its libidinal, economic, political, and ecological realities. So such a capacious sense of the concept, thinking past the UN's discourse on human rights violations, requires being open to forms of impunity that are not always traceable to particular people or perpetrators, but instead point to the systemic conditions that enable impunity to be practiced, whether it's collective or whether it's practiced by individual agents. Impunity names a sort of excess of the law in its very operations, and as such it requires diverse methodologies. This is so because it seems the concept has haunted other concepts so familiar to us. And I think it might be, I'm finding it productive to read sort of the classic texts of different critical traditions through the angle of impunity, even when where the word doesn't appear. So in Marx, for example, impunity would have to be a condition of primitive accumulation itself, that is, of the state's violent synchronization of divergent historical and economic processes. For the liberal tradition of political thought, impunity might name an assumption of a scandalous freedom without limits, violating the presumptive legal equality among persons before the law. In psychoanalysis, impunity might operate by means of a regressive fantasy of escaping one's own death. In each instance, impunity functions in an indistinct zone between potentiality, a scandalous possibility, and the operative principle, operative all along, that is somehow only named after the fact. That is, after the violence it has wrought. In the brief time I have remaining, I would like to tease out one particular theoretical tradition, deconstruction, and consider how it helps us to think about impunity. So I'm going to discuss the force of law in a little bit of detail. So in 1990, Jacques Derrida gives a lecture at the Cardozo School of Law entitled Force of Law, the Mystical Foundation of Authority, where he thinks through how the primal scene, if you will, of the legal judgment operates by means of excess that reaches beyond the moment of decision or judgment. So there are two elements of Derrida's essay I want to focus on. One, analyzing what Derrida teaches us about the extra-juridical realm that is regulated by the juridical. And secondly, parsing the meanings of justice in Derrida's reflections on law. So to think about impunity, the secret sharer of impunity seems to be justice. That seems to be one of the things at stake in thinking about impunity. And of course, Derrida does not mention the word impunity in this essay. He considers through a reading of Montaigne and Benjamin, and this is Benjamin's Critique of Violence essay, what deconstruction might contribute to our understanding of law and justice. Montaigne had described a central crisis at the heart of all law, namely that it does not secure justice, that justice and the functioning of the law are radically foreign to each other. This is so, according to Montaigne, in part because legal categories are never adequate to the sheer diversity and multiplicity of human actions. Law operates, according to Montaigne, by means of custom and by sheer authority. Laws are respected not because in truth they are just, but, and I quote, but because they are laws. He writes, this is Montaigne, that is the mystical foundation of their authority. And that's where Derrida gets his subtitle, The Mystical Foundation of Authority. And some of you might recall Derrida's essay is in two parts, where the first section he considers deconstruction's contribution to the understanding of justice, and the second part is a deep engagement with Benjamin. I would like to consider the different aspects of this mystical authority, rife with mysteries, not only of the state, but also of the substance that binds social relations. This mystical authority is critical to the operations of law, and is so often invisible in its operations. Impunity has an intimate relation to the law's mystical foundation. So let's briefly follow a moment in Derrida's essay where he considers the basis of the force of law, of what Benjamin calls Gewalt, which in German is a combination of force, authority, and violence. So what is the basis of this force of law? Derrida considers the problem of differentiating between the force of a legitimate power or law and the supposedly originary Gewalt that established this power, a violence that necessarily would not have been authorized by a prior authority. Derrida writes, so that in this initial moment, in that moment of foundation, it is neither legal nor illegal, this foundational violence, if it is, and also Derrida casts doubt on whether or not these things really exist, or whether it's foundational claim. He always calls it supposedly foundational. This is to say, this so-called originary violence is neither legitimate nor illegitimate. Its performative nature is like the nature of performative utterances, which are neither true nor false. This prior violence that establishes the law necessarily enjoys impunity of a very specific type. This violence is not in violation of a previously existing law, and as such it is neither legal nor illegal. Outside the purview of law, not in its suspension, but in its absence, this violence may be committed without accountability. In fact, cannot serve as foundational if it claims to be foundational, except with the absence of accountability, authorization, or legitimacy. What are the implications of reading impunity as this kind of excess at the heart of the law's mystical foundation? At one point, Derrida refers to this inaugurating founding violence as a kind of coup de force, enacting performative power itself. In his deconstruction in a different essay of the Declaration of Independence, he demonstrates how the chain of signatories to the founding document, the ultimate and the performative, must rely on the constitutive. The signatories to this founding document give themselves the authority to sign a list of complaints and at the same time reference God, a pre-existing authority, who authorizes the founding act. This is so because no signature or founding act can guarantee its own authority. It must rely in a fashion illegitimate to its manifest claims on a previous guarantee. In Derrida's reading of Declaration of Independence, the Declaration of Independence can serve as a founding document because of the undecidability of a gesture that presents performative statements as constitutive ones. The document gains its performative power in this moment of risk, in the space of a vulnerability whose historical conditions are the conditions of its iterability. Regarding such power of founding, and this power is always vulnerable, Derrida implies, Derrida writes in Force of Law, and I quote, "It is what I here propose to call the mystical. Here a silence is walled up in the violent structure of the founding act," unquote. This silence, it turns out, speaks of many things. Following Derrida, following Benjamin, the law-making Gewalt repeats in a movement of displacement in the operations of the law itself, represented in all those institutions, the police, the courts, the army, that practice a law-preserving Gewalt. In this movement of difference, impunity modulates into the very conditions of legality itself. Once a practice outside the purview of all authority, outside the sphere of the legitimate and the illegitimate, it now comes to underwrite the everyday forms of calculability surrounding the legal and the illegal. Once the Gewalt regulating authorities are established, the violation of their rules, at least in theory, or at least formally, have to be accountable to the rules themselves. There shall be no impunity, so the story goes. So the law seems to originate in the moment of impunity that then comes to regulate the law itself. Moreover, the enforceability of the law stretches into extrajuridical domains far removed from the scene in the courtroom. Boundaries become ambiguous. The law is enforced whether or not one is aware of it. And the unlocatable guilt, or its absence, that results from the suprajuridical force of law becomes a cornerstone of modern subjectivity. And this is, of course, a horror that Kafka has captured really well. So one can hardly speak of the law without the possibility of this excess of the extrajuridical that the law regulates precisely through the juridical. As we've seen, nothing intrinsic in the law secures justice. The law is haunted by an aporia, founded as it is by means of an impunity that results in the outlying of impunity itself, at least formally. This aporia, resulting from the law's mystical foundation, is related to the key aporia on which Derrida's argument turns, and I quote, he says, "The decision between just and unjust is never ensured by a rule." This is so because if one is simply applying the law like a rule, like a calculating machine to a particular case, then the act of judgment does not enact justice. This is Derrida's argument. Justice is broached when the decision, the judgment, halts before the unsubsumable particularity of the case, confronted with the experience of the undecidable, and arrives at a verdict that in its reiteration reinvents the rule itself. According to Derrida, we still could not call that judgment just, because we have a limitless responsibility to the other, a responsibility that requires that our assessment of justice hold wide open the possibility at every turn of not having arrived at justice. As such, he says, justice is the experience of the impossible, end quote. The schism that Montaigne had indicated between law and justice becomes, as an experience of the aporia and of the undecidable, the very grounds for raising the stakes of the project of achieving justice, and even more, the grounds for justice itself. To say that justice has been done risks diminishing justice itself. Derrida gives the example of subjects who may not historically have counted as subjects. Violence done to such people would not register as an injustice because the charge of injustice, and I quote, supposes that the other, the victim of language's injustice, is capable of language in general. Is man as a speaking animal in the sense that we men give to this word language? And this is still Derrida. Moreover, there was a time not long ago, and not yet over, in which we men, we meant we adult white male Europeans, carnivorous and capable of sacrifice, end quote. For imperialism, including its neoliberal formations, one of the underlying calculations is to consider which population is worthy of subjection by means of contract, and which one can be exposed to precarity or wiped off the face of the earth. Even the truth of the utterance, injustice has been done, and this is an utterance that we, good lefties, good progressives, feel that we can arrive at very clearly. It always seems clear to us that injustice is done. But one of the implications of Derrida's argument is that even the truth of the utterance, injustice has been done, has depended on prior understandings of the subject worthy, if you will, of injustice, since some people have not counted as subjects. The boundary around what constitutes a subject of injustice is a perennial problem for politics. Earlier, in the moment of foundational violence, we were concerned with the distinction, or lack thereof, between the legal and the illegal. Here, in the instance of beings who might not count as subjects, it is the distinction between just and unjust that is markedly absent. Violence done to such subjects, a brutal combination of structural and isolated acts of violence, can and has been done with impunity. Hence Derrida's radical call for thinking of justice as the experience of the impossible, keeping open the possibility that justice has not yet been delivered. In order to comport legal judgments in the direction of justice, which is really all one can do, decisions, insofar as they reinstitute and reinvent a rule by means of an act of interpretation, must be, and I quote Derrida, these decisions must be both regulated and without regulation, conserve the law and also destroy it, or suspend it enough to have to reinvent it in each case, re-justify it, or at least reinvent it in the reaffirmation and the new and free confirmation of its principle, end quote. A decision that is both regulated and without regulation, a decision that destroys the law and also preserves it or suspends it by confirming its principle. This is the transmutation of an originary gestalt in the service of justice. Recall that the originary authority, that enjoyed impunity, that assumed itself to be foundational or gave itself a foundation and enjoyed impunity, standing outside the orbit of legitimacy or illegitimacy altogether, that this was the status of this original authority. Now that force is only faintly recognizable as impunity. Decisions must be unregulated, destructive of the law, and a mark of the law's suspension at the same time as the decision is regulated, law-preserving, and confirms the law's principle. If one can speak of something like impunity here, and I'm not totally sure that this word would apply in this instance, it would be impunity as illegitimacy. That aspect of the undecidable moment in which the law has to be suspended in order to do justice to its ends. This is a moment of risk-taking because it is a moment of free decision, as opposed to the mechanical application of a rule. This is how, according to Derrida, the decision can serve the interest of justice, even if we can never say and must not say that justice has been done. Where Montaigne had indicated the danger, Derrida finds in the same place a saving grace, the inadequation of law to the unsubsumable example. Justice emerges from what Derrida calls the sense of a responsibility without limits, so necessarily excessive and calculable before memory. If exacting justice means to face the experience of the impossible, then the experience that is all too possible and immediately at hand can be presumed to be one of injustice. Derrida has given us a generative way of thinking about justice, but what of injustice? Is justice incalculable, but injustice readily calculable? Or is the sense of responsibility that is a very condition of a possible justice limitless because the injustice it addresses is itself without limits? What does it mean to say, what does it mean that we cannot say, this is a just decision, justice has been done, but we can say injustice has prevailed. What are the assumptions of this statement that we make, that we hold on to? That injustice has prevailed. It would have to follow that injustice is also incalculable. It would have to be, given that the field of subjects who are recognized as receiving unjust treatment has been historically variable. The danger that attends the utterance, "this is a just decision," is that it is poised to turn justice into another precedent, another rule, when justice cannot be delivered by rules. So we are cast back into the assumption that it is from a space of injustice that we pose the problems of justice. So what do we do with this assumption? Far from casting doubt on the existence of injustice in the world, I'm taking Derrida at his own word that, and I quote, "responsibility toward memory is a responsibility before the very concept of responsibility that regulates the justice and appropriateness of our behavior, of our theoretical, practical, and ethical political decisions," end quote. Derrida accepts that an interrogation of this responsibility necessarily creates anxiety, but no deconstruction would be possible without such interrogation, without appealing to something beyond the determinations of given contexts in order to approach the possibility of justice itself. In that spirit, then, I submit, how do we know injustice? I ask this naive question, not because I seek a foundational explanation for the injustices I can easily inventory, but because our current historical moment leads me to this question in a very specific way. The young white supremacists parading around Charlottesville and other locations since then, too, cry out injustice. Vulnerability, wounding, a sense of being wronged fires up their agonistic rhetoric, and this fact should only remind us that the totalitarian movements that their protests cite also constituted themselves around a sense of injustice. Assuming injustice as a way of comporting toward justice is not in itself sufficient. Perhaps injustice is a little too readily discernible, at hand for forms of politics that may be in conflict with each other, but whose complaints at a formal level are commensurate. With respect to white supremacist marches, it would help to understand their sense of injustice as related to the force of law in its performative authority. All marches, of course, are performative acts, assuming an authority that is simultaneously given to them as well. And the disturbing demands of the white supremacists accrue authority from a long history of tacitly granted impunity. If the law operates by means of excess, this does not always mean that the letter of the law regulates all extrajuridical spheres. Such an excess at the heart of the law also means that in certain conditions, a law will cancel itself and do so silently, that certain acts need not even be heard in the court of law. In the United States, for example, lynchings regularly occurred without the threat of law's force. Derrida, once again, I remind us of his quotation, he says about the mystical foundation of the law, "Here a silence is walled up in the violent structure of the founding act." This silence has many names. Is one of the names of this silence, when we're thinking about the United States, whiteness? And when the violence of the founding act repeats in its representative forms, the police, the courts, the army, etc., and repeats in all those extrajuridical spaces, the dark suburban street, the trees of the South, the spaces of public transit, the racially regulated spaces of cities and towns, the schism between the letter of the law and the singular example comes to the fore, both as the certainty of injustice and the space for the possibility of justice. The law is haunted by impunity, either in the form of a suspension of the law or prior to this in a self-authorizing and foundational gavalt. In addition, there are flagrant instances of impunity, the legacies of slavery, the rise of the carceral state, and the pattern of police brutality in the United States bespeak a history where the force of law regularly produces injustice, where impunity operates in the service of a disproportionate use of violence. There is the impunity granted to police officers by a court's decision, but prior to this, there is the pernicious tendency of police agents to assume impunity when they disproportionately apply the force of law to racialized bodies. Derrida reminds us in a key turn in his argument in Force of Law of Benjamin's reading of the police under liberal democracies, and I quote from Benjamin, "The police intervene for security reasons," this is in quotation marks, "for security reasons. in countless cases where no clear legal situation exists. Police power is formless, like its nowhere tangible, all-pervasive, ghostly presence in the life of civilized states, bearing witness to the greatest conceivable degeneration of violence. This is one of the cornerstones of Benjamin's critique of liberal democracies, the police power. This is so because policing entails a suspension of the distinction between lawmaking and law preserving. In order to preserve the law, the police agent's word acts as if it were the law. The mystical foundation of the law resides in this self-authorizing fictionality. Given US history, whiteness is part and parcel of this mystical foundation. In a recent article, one that Joan also cited in The Atlantic called The First White President, Ta-Nehisi Coates suggests that Trump's triumph rests securely on whiteness, itself a strangely tautological and self-authorizing phenomenon, and intimately tied to an order that delivers violence in the guise of fate. Not only did Trump have broad support across all classes, but also that common thread linking the support across the classes was whiteness. This is Coates' argument. In our contemporary historical juncture, Coates argues, class is being deployed to conceal its conjunctures with a racialized history of injustice. Pitting the white working class against the black has a long history. In the 19th century, pro-slavery intellectuals, this is all Coates, such as George Fitzhugh, argued that white workers were terribly exploited, quote, slaves without masters, and black workers, by contrast, were, quote, elevated by enslavement, since a master provided for them. And I quote from Coates' piece, nevertheless, the argument that America's original sin was not deep-seated white supremacy, but rather the exploitation of white labor by white capitalists, white slavery, proved durable. Indeed, the panic of white slavery lives on in our politics today. Black workers suffer because it was and is our lot. But when white workers suffer, something in nature has gone awry. And so an opioid epidemic among mostly white people is greeted with calls for compassion and treatment, as all epidemics should be, while a crack epidemic among mostly black people is greeted with scorn and mandatory minimums, end quote. One kind of person is worthy of grievance, another is left to their grief. Mandatory minimums are akin to the operations of fate, a threatening violence that in this historical example, strikes in multifarious forms, representing, reinventing the foundational gestalt in all of its excessive power. Given Coates' example of the violences of enduring white supremacy, it becomes clear that claiming injustice for itself, white slavery, has been critical to the constitution of whiteness, an element of the mystical foundation of American authority. The aim is not to argue that white workers were not dealt injustice at the hands of capital, but that this fact need not be adduced in order to naturalize the injustices faced by black populations, precisely how this fact has been historically deployed. Trump is the first white president because whiteness as an actively sought ideal has secured impunity for him, according to Coates. He says it is the very core of his power. Coates says this about Trump. This is a mystical power, as Coates realizes well, because he himself refers to whiteness as a bloody heirloom, passed by means of a violent tradition. And I quote, but whereas his forebears carried whiteness like an ancestral talisman, Trump cracked the glowing amulet open, releasing its eldritch energies, end quote. These are energies of a foundational gestalt that is all the more powerful for not being codified, an excess operating in the future interior to secure emerging forms of impunity. The mystery of whiteness is such that it secures its supposed universal vantage point by policing when it can be named. It finds itself when it feels itself besieged. It is both the silent standard of what might count as justice, while claiming enduring injustice as its foundational experience. A sense of vulnerability, in other words, underwrites its assumption of impunity. Of course, it matters whether vulnerability is perceived or real, but the sense of vulnerability creates the possibility of a habitation in which the law can be seen as not applying to oneself, even when the world has been assembled in so many ways around oneself, or laws and norms created to ensure heterogeneity can be appropriated for the sake of one's own burning and besieged singularity. And here I'm thinking about the increasing appropriation by white supremacists of language of civil rights. And I'm also in the background thinking of Butler's account of moral sadism from Frames of War, where she talks about identifying with a kind of injustice, and from that identification launching all manner of regression onto others. Derrida's account of the force of law speaks directly to these historical conditions. Recall that in Derrida's account, the violence that takes itself to be foundational operates in the space of an impunity defined as being outside the orbit of legitimacy altogether. Once established, the law can make justice possible, but only in the face of an undecidable moment of decision where the law must be suspended in order to be reinvented. So just reminding us. Its suspension is as critical as the eventual confirmation of its principle, which is not necessarily the same as its word. In other words, if the abyss between the law and the unsubsumable example points to the unjust operations of the law, where justice is when justice is approximated, it carries with it a tinge of the illegitimate. If mandatory minimums are an example of the deep intertwinement of white supremacy with the rule of law, that is, if existing law has delivered a history of violent injustice, then it follows that justice will appear illegitimate, a scandal from the standpoint of these laws. That illegitimacy is what Derrida's understanding of the undecidable opens up, without guarantees. Justice as a form of illegitimacy. Recall that a certain vulnerability already attended the supposedly foundational Gewalt in its insecurely self-authorizing act that enjoyed impunity, and that approximating justice also requires vulnerability in that the law must be suspended in order to be reinvented. Vulnerability, it seems, is the other side of impunity, both in the operations of the law and in the actions of subjects who seek to escape its force, whether they are dominant groups or less dominant groups. The language of vulnerability is what opposing political groups have in common, and such language is the basis for an appeal to the law's protection, but also the basis for rendering the law illegitimate. Since vulnerability does not have a political attachment, it follows that neither does impunity, not in itself. It can inaugurate a legal order. As a form of illegitimacy, it can create the possibility of justice by opposing unjust laws. It can also threaten a social order with forms of extreme violence. Mind you, when I talk about impunity as illegitimacy, I have in mind, for example, Frantz Fanon's ideas about revolutionary violence. Impunity as illegitimacy is one way of describing revolutionary violence, but it indicates a weaker procedural or formal understanding of impunity as a lack of accountability to actually existing unjust laws. As Fanon's account of revolutionary violence shows, that this kind of revolutionary impunity must be held accountable, in fact, to notions of freedom as justice. Insofar as it invokes questions concerning accountability, redress, and responsibility, impunity as a political concept requires contending with an ethical horizon. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for those two wonderful opening papers. So we have about 35 or 40 minutes for Q&A, and I will keep a queue, so don't hesitate to signal me, and I'll try to look all around the room, not just at the center table, to get you on the queue. But right now, I'm going to recognize Tim Buse, who will ask the first question, and then others can just sort of let me know. Okay.
I assumed I would be already number 5 or 6 on this list, so I'm regretting my hasty. Thank you. I love these. Anyway, these great bracing papers. In particular, I think that there's a kind of really encouraging quality to both of them. Joan, the page is going to, not the page is going to turn, the hand is going to be, the new hand is going to be dealt, and it seems to me, and so Zahid, it seems that similarly there will be that kind of arrival of the ethical horizon, and in fact a new sense of punitiveness will dissent. It seems to me clear from both of your analyses. But my question is then for Zayed, I think, and I want to sort of, in a sense, come back to a distinction that Joan made very early on in her paper between a word and a concept. The word being unambiguous in use, and a concept being essentially ambiguous in use. And I want to kind of return to that in order to ask Zayed, how useful is the kind of Derridean analysis, which is so much predicated, it seems to be, upon a concept, and in fact, in a sense, in suspending the ethical horizon that you I was very grateful for that last little moment in your paper, because I think it was very important to sort of invoke the impending descent of the ethical horizon. But I was, and I felt that the other kind of moment that is sort of haunting this current moment is the Me Too hashtag moment, because it seems to me that we're in a moment where that ethical horizon has arrived for a particular formally what's the word? What's the adjective for impunity? A form of, sorry? A form, I mean, in other words, impunity has ended for a certain kind of behavior. So that seems to me a good model for, I mean, the Me Too hashtag is all about Trump, it seems to me, and Trumpism, or at least one thing. It's partly about that. So, but my question is whether the analysis of impunity through Derrida is the place where we can get to think the arrival of the ethical horizon, or whether in fact we need to suspend that analysis. I'm not sure whether it's Derrida that gets us to the place we need to be, rather than other figures that you were invoking earlier on in your paper.
Yeah, I mean, first I would say that it doesn't seem to me that Derrida does suspend the ethical horizon. It's very uncharacteristically, he's categorical in that argument, in that piece, where he says that all of his remarks are pitched towards a limitless responsibility to the unsubsumable example, to the other. But then, of course, you know, in Derridian terms, what does that limitless responsibility mean, and what are the terms in which it can be arrived at? And that is that's what the essay seeks to unpack. But I don't think he suspends the ethical at all. In fact, the whole essay is written in the space of an ethical responsibility. But I hear you. I think to be true to Derrida, one must suspend him as well. And I think that's interesting to consider what that would mean. What I find productive is that he allows me to think these extremes together, which is both something that I see within legal studies, that the critique of anti-impunity takes up an important point, which is that why assume that punishment is necessarily a solution, or sometimes accountability is punishment. And I also think with hashtag #MeToo, there's a danger there as well. And I'm not sure that I would follow you there saying that a certain kind of impunity is now coming to an end. It feels like it's opening up as a question, and I think that's the interesting thing about the Me Too hashtag. But I do wonder about the trace of a solution, that punishment would solve the problems that Me Too is bringing up. I worry about that a little bit. Is it Joan?
I don't think you asked me a question.
Okay, the next three questioners are Ben, Akil, and Susan.
This question is for Joan. It's about David Mamet, and it's a two-part question. So when you were talking about Melville's Confidence Man, I was making little notes about a different David Mamet movie, House of Games. And there's a scene in that movie where I think Joe Mantegna says to Lindsay Krause, who's a psychotherapist, he's a con man, he says, the reason you call it a con game is I give you my confidence. And this is demonstrated in one of the cons they execute with, I think, William H. Macy. And in this, you give the confidence to the person whose money you're trying to take. And so part one of my question is, how does this relate to Trump? In what way can we say that Trump has, as part of his con, the giving of confidence to the populace or his followers? How is this going on, or is that the case? As a preliminary to bilking them. And then question two is about the end game of all this, which is the moment of unmasking or the reveal where it's shown this was only a con. I guess my sense is that that's a very ineffective and debilitating realization. So to realize that one has been conned is possibly very shameful and secret, and it's very different from other forms of unmasking. So I think in The Wizard of Oz, when Dorothy sees that Toto has pulled back the curtain, I think she essentially beats the wizard with her handbag and says, "You're a very bad man." And he says, "Well, no, I'm only a bad wizard," which is maybe an important distinction also. But she's not ashamed. But for me, if I was conned, and I think this would be something I would not want to make public. This wouldn't. It's different from you lied to us. It's sort of, well, I think particularly because of the first part of the question, your confidence in me, in fact, was misplaced. That's part of the con. So in House of Games, William H. Macy, in being conned, has done something, I think, a bit shady, right? And so you're complicit in this. And so the two parts of the question is, how does Trump give us or the people, and this was part of his inaugural address too, I think, I'm returning power to you. How does he give us his confidence? And then part two, is there a sort of shamefulness that is debilitating as the realization of this, as the end game? Can we hold on to that?
So I think the first part is more the Melville Confidence Man for me than the David Mamet, in the sense that in the Confidence Man, whenever he is producing a scam, he always starts by saying, "Do you have confidence in me?" It's always about confidence in me. That is, it's really amazing. In fact, it's very hard in the novel. I don't know how many of you have read it recently, but it's very hard to figure out each time a new person appears on the scene, whether this is the Confidence Man in a new guise. But you know it. Melville signals it to you by the guy always saying to whoever his next target is, "Do you have confidence in me? I can't do this without your having confidence in me." So I think the first part of your question, I would say, is about the assumption that I am worthy of your confidence. And I think that's what the inaugural speech was actually about, too. And I am worthy of your confidence because I am this father, this primal father, who has all the women, who can break all the laws. I mean, there I think you need totem and taboo rather than David Mamet, maybe, to analyze it. But it's that I am the person who can take care of this for you. If you have confidence in me, it's going to be all right. The second part, I think, is I don't think we see any evidence of that. I mean, I think that the brilliance of the scheme is that nobody succumbs to the constant revelation of lies. I mean, not nobody, his followers do not succumb to the constant revelation of lies, misstatements. I mean, the Times, the Washington Post, all of the established media spend all of their time trying to prove or show you exactly what you're saying, that you ought to be ashamed of yourself for believing in this guy. And his followers are untouched by this, as is the Republican Congress right now. So I think that the idea that a politics of shame would somehow right this wrong or get rid of this monster is not going to work. And it's proven itself not to be working. The lies are, any lie he offers is taken up. And even people who say, I mean, some of those interviews with people in the coal country who say, well, we knew he was never going to bring back coal to our area, but we voted for him anyway because on some level we had confidence in him that he would right the situation in some other way. So I think it's the manipulation of, it's the confidence man who never gets exposed as the huckster or scam that he is that's so puzzling, I guess, about this phenomenon.
Can somebody pass the mic to him? Thank you.
Zahid, this is a question for you. I was curious about when you used the expression towards the end of your paper that impunity is a case of the law not applying to the subject who has impunity.
Speak more closer to the microphone. We can't hear you.
Sorry. That the law doesn't apply to the subject who has impunity. And I was curious about whether there is, what is to be said about whether what the subject has done is so much as to be identified as a wrongdoing. If there is, I mean, on what grounds is it properly describable as a wrongdoing if law doesn't apply, right? So that's a general question. Now, when you appealed, before you defined or characterized impunity this way, to Derrida's discussion of the foundational moment and the violence in it, it's interesting that, this is just really another question. One kind of violence in the foundational moment you can find in Genesis, for instance, because after all, the subjects are punished, but it's only after she ingested the apple that she got the concepts of good and bad, and yet there was punishment of something done prior to having the concept of good and bad. And so it must have been simply because of the disobedience, right? But the disobedience is now to be described in neutral terms, not normative terms. So it's just brute power, nothing to do with norms. So I'm just curious about how the foundational moment that Derrida describes is different from what Foucault and Hacking describe as the alchemy by which something like a notion of average, which is a purely descriptive notion, right? Some middle point between, becomes a norm and generates notions of health and things like that, you know, completely normative notions. So it's really just the same old issue, isn't it? Unless you think of it as power, disobedience of an order and so on, which is a different form of Genesis. So I'm just curious about how it relates to other.
Sure, thank you for that. I think one of the things I'm interested in is reading impunity back into these different critical traditions. And I think you're absolutely correct in your suggestion that there's a resonance between Derrida's notion of foundational violence and what Foucault is talking about. And that resonance doesn't bother me so much. But the space that Derrida opened up for me in this engagement was just to think about how impunity can be a condition of the operations of the law itself. So as such, to go to the first part of your question, when I was saying towards the end of the paper that the person who enjoys impunity is not regulated by the law, that was referring to a formal definition of impunity. But in fact, what it seems to me, and this is what Derrida helps me to think, is that impunity adheres to the operations of the law itself. Because either in the case of unjust laws, for example, mandatory minimums, as Coates criticizes, so the law creates, without accountability, a set of violences and repeats them over and over, or as a kind of excess to the law as well. So I don't think that law I think the law is one of the conditions for impunity. And that's a paradox that I feel I would not have arrived at except through Derrida.
Okay, the next three on the queue are Susan, Stephen, and I'm sorry, I don't know your name. David, okay. So Susan?
Is it on? Yeah. Okay, thank you. I think they're great papers, and I enjoyed them a lot. I want to try to bring them together in a certain way, and I have to say I'm a little bit cheating because I know these two guys very well, and we've been discussing this issue all semester. So I'm kind of like, but that doesn't mean the question's going to be that great. It's just I know these people. Okay. So I'm interested in where you began, Joan, which was the distinction between a name and a concept. And then, Tim, what you brought up about the problem with concepts is they're ambiguous. They can't be actually pinned down. But there is a way that this problem, this aporia, can be resolved, it seems to me, and Benjamin gives us an opportunity to do that if, and here going to a point that Joan made at the beginning, if history, the historical moment, becomes the specificity of the application of the concept. And I would talk about that in terms of Walter Benjamin's idea of the name, which is different from just a name, a kind of singularity, Trump, the one crazy man, right? But that it names a certain specification, specificity of our moment. And that, then I think we can allow these papers to interrelate in a really productive way. So let me just take one possible way that could work. So if we start with where Zahid started, which is this horrendous moment of, I could go out on Fifth Avenue and shoot someone and it wouldn't matter, that as a kind of, description of what impunity implies. And I'm sure that it's a Steve Bannon phrase that, because it's too intelligent for Trump to make that observation, right? But let's let that be, and let's call it a little bit surreal too, because it is a surreal act, and that is the famous or favorite word of Donald Trump Jr. and others when actually Trump won, that this is surreal, This is kind of a kind of description of that historical event, right? So if we look at that, however, as, and then I'm going back to Joan's point, as a moment where a crisis already exists and Trump performs it or manifests it, rather than reflecting it or even causing it, that it's there in that historical moment. If we see that historical moment as one of crisis, right, then in Zahid's terms, we might think of an unraveling of a certain regime of legitimacy or legitimacy, let's say, or authority, whatever, that it's unraveling. And in that space, there is no founding moment of a new. This is not a revolution in any meaningful sense of the term. There's no founding moment of something new, but there is an unraveling of something old. Then we could see even something true about Trump's statement, right? And that is that in this moment of sovereignty unraveling, it becomes a space of impunity. And that is extremely frightening. We really don't want to reestablish the primal father, but I'll tell you, it's very frightening to live in a space when sovereignty, some sort of notion of injustice is coming to the fore in a space where justice is not guaranteed even the inadequate justice of an existing order. So that's not really a question, but it's a way of bringing those two things together that I'd like to hear comments on.
You want to vote? I'm not sure what to say. I mean, I think, yes. I mean, I really don't know what else to say. The notion of there's no founding moment of something new and an unraveling of something else is a really nice way to sort of put them together, I think. The only thing I would say is the unraveling of something old is state sovereignty, but what's staying in place is global capital, right? And that's neither new. That is, in a sense, that's there. It's untouched by his presence or his performance or all the rest of it. It's more of the same in a certain way, but in an exaggerated, grotesque form. I don't know what else to say beyond that.
Actually, I'm going to continue what Joan was just saying, and then for this side of the table, when I think about Joan's statement, which I completely agree with, that global capital is something that remains unchallenged, even when sovereignty has been challenged, it makes me wonder what the relationship between sovereignty and global capital is. I mean, it's been completely shocking that, you know, everyone has been celebrating how great the economy is doing, and you know, the markets did not crash as expected when Trump was elected, and the markets probably would have been fine had Hillary been elected too. And I think this wonders whether the question of impunity also has to be, this is why I'm interested in impunity that does not point to a particular agent. I mean, so, you know, Benjamin's whole thing, you know, if in Sachsenberg, it's a mystery story and it's a whodunit, and capitalism's done it. But there's a way in which capital has the ultimate impunity. And that is both, it feels like a platitude and an insight to me. And I don't know where to go with that.
To the extent that impunity, or that impunity is without cost.
Right, yes.
Right? There's something in that too. That the impunity means you can do something without cost.
Without cost, without consequence.
Yeah.
But
But
then
cost is the operative word.
But can I just add one sentence here? I mean, this is what Jared Kushner was supposed to do, which is turn the United States into an American company and do well by our customers, i.e. our citizens. That's his words. In other words, to actually use the model with its impunities of global capital to recreate a notion of local sovereignty. So the American company would have a certain territorial base that used to be the United States.
Akil had something to add.
Yeah, I do. But Zahid, when one talks about the impunity of global capital, it isn't as if there aren't capacities for agency that states have. They just willingly have surrendered them.
Right.
But there's no reason why. I mean, you can put capital controls. You can prevent capital flight by fining corporations which want to fly out of the country if you have progressive policies and so on. These are not completely agentless things. It's a very willful domination of a certain kind, which is only impunity because I think for all sorts of reasons, all sorts of countries have consented to it. But it isn't as if consent hasn't taken place. It isn't as if movements cannot insist on that certain controls be put on capital and so on. We've you know, in this country, Sanders tried to do it, and he was sneered as for being a populist. Of course, he was a very different kind of populist, but there was immense sneering of Sanders. There was, you know, Lula tried to do it. Made it very hard to find corporations that wanted to fly out. So it isn't as if it's agentless, right? There's just a lot of the same old politics, lack of left-wing mobilizations for all sorts of reasons. The people who've really lost agencies are unions, who have not been able to have movements ever since, at least since the Lula period. Even Latin American movements have dissipated. So So I think there's more detail to the loss of agency than just simply a kind of circulating capital.
There is, but what about the notion that I was very taken by in Wendy Brown's Undoing the Demos of a certain kind of neoliberal rationality that has redefined homo politicus into, and all of us, into homo economicus, so that the economic motive for or economics is the motive now for everything. Cost calculations. I mean, look at universities, right? The universities we used to live in, which had a whole set of other notions of what the function of the university was, are now fundraising agencies that have clients coming to buy a degree from them.
Yeah, but what I was trying to say, Joan, was that in the past, for instance, in the Keynesian period, when there was real social democracy, when there were safety nets for the worse off and so on, that was a result of about 75-year-old labor movements from the late 19th century. Those labor movements were the agents which brought about such a thing. Right? Now, because of what you call the globalization of capital, whenever there is a progressive labor movement, say as in Brazil, when Lula was elected by it, capital flies out. So you need a movement where capital flies too. But the idea that there should be global solidarities of labor is, I think, mad. It's a myth. I mean, I don't even know how to begin to think about it. You know, Hart and Negri have this completely empty idea of multitude. What on earth is that? I mean, you have to actually talk of what the solidarities at the global level would be. And so what you need, I think, is for countries to actually put capital controls that just don't allow capital flight.
Yeah, which are certainly possible to imagine.
Which is certainly possible, but what kind of politics will bring it about that's what
well,
we
at
have
the
to
same
decide.
moment that they're destroying unions, right? I mean, that the same moment that the unions, if this next Supreme Court case goes through, this Friedrichs case,
Yes,
the unions are done.
Well, that's right. So one of the most interesting questions is when labor is so completely informalized and impermanent and casual and contractualized and so on, you can't have the old shop floor labor unions. You just can't, because it isn't organized full-time labor anymore.
Right.
So what we have to think about are what are the agencies of movements when labor takes a completely different form.
Yeah.
Okay, Stephen?
Thanks so much to you both. This is a question for Zahid. At a point in your remarks, you talked about the sort of tiki torch shirts of Charlottesville, the white supremacists, as I think you described them as participating in a sort of agonistic conflict and paying attention to their grievances, making the argument that paying attention to their grievances was sort of crucial.
Oh, God, no.
Oh, okay.
No. Sorry.
Oh, okay. So, but you did describe it as agonistic, which doesn't quite seem right to me, for sort of Chantal Mouffe reasons. In The Democratic Paradox, she draws a distinction between agonism and antagonism. Antagonism being the sort of classic Schmittian opponents as enemies who have to be ontologically destroyed to win, as opposed to agonism where the opponent is an adversary who doesn't. And I think the sort of difference of our designation of those people signifies that the line is really hard to draw. It's hard to identify for any given observer whether a group is a sort of antagonistic enemy or a agonistic adversary. So I'm wondering if you might be able to sort of sketch out a couple of thoughts on how we might, as observers of people like this, be able to distinguish a sort of adversary from an enemy, whether we should think of them as agonistic participants or whether they're antagonists.
Yeah, thank you for that. To be honest, I hadn't. I'm happy to call them antagonists as well, and I don't have as well that granular understanding of these terms that you obviously have. So I would need to think more about this. But just to make my remarks about that moment in my argument clearer, I don't think that their grievances are necessarily real grievances or need to be attended to or anything like that. But what I find interesting is their rhetoric that around "you will not replace us," and the rhetoric of injustice and the language that they have inherited from social movements to describe what they perceive to be their own justice. I find that rhetoric interesting. But I'll need to, I'm happy to call them antagonists, and I'm happy to think further about the difference between agonism and antagonism. But that's not where the stress was falling for me as much.
David?
Okay, thank you. I guess it's a question for Joan based on the impunity thing. You know, I guess I was thinking about, you know, you made this reference to, you know, Weberian charisma in the middle of it, and you know, the appeal of Trump and the effects of it, you know, while we're still playing this hand, right? While we're still playing this hand, and sort of what do we do in the wake of that? Because I was thinking not just about narcissism, but also about nihilism. I mean, the unraveling is this kind of Nietzschean wiping away of the horizon, right? This transvaluation of values. And so the anxiety about the possibility of accountability in this moment is real. Now, I should say also that Mueller indicted Michael Flynn right before you spoke. Right, this morning, right?
What happened, sorry?
Oh, Michael Flynn's been indicted by Mueller for lying to the FBI. And he's pleading guilty, and he's... Great. So, you know, I want to say, like, there have been moments of hope of accountability in the last year around the courts, and a kind of misplaced moment of authority around the military. So it's not just capitalism, but the military. So for example, Mattis and Kelly, right? And so I think it's not just global capitalism that's the background here, but it's imperialism. It's military imperialism that's in the background here, where you know, folks are thinking, well, if the law doesn't enforce, who's going to enforce, right? If the laws, right? And you know, this is not a welcome thing, but I'm just saying that that is entering in the space of anxiety around accountability, right? So that, you know, Trump has shown his charisma to be cunning, and that cunning is appealing. You know, that narcissism is appealing, and it's doing something not just to our culture, but globally.
What do you want me to say about that? I mean, yes, I mean, I think, you know, when I wrote those last lines about when the next hand would be dealt, I have to say, Tim, it was, I thought to myself, are you kidding? You need to do this. You need to have some gesture of optimism or hope. I'm not sure that I really have it. So.
And you may lose everything in the hand that you're playing right now.
Yeah, well, that's right. Thank you. I mean, that's the other thing to add to that. You could lose everything in that in the hand that's underway, in play at the moment. So I guess I'd be interested to hear what Zahid says. I think, yeah, of course we need everything we can have to insist on accountability, to put the law in place. But then, you know, you read about the hundreds of judges that are about to be appointed, ideologically chosen judges. You read what Frank Rich, and I quote that, calls the guardrails of constitutional democracy are being sort of pushed aside or run over. So the question I guess I still have is the extent to which this kind of accountability, much as we love to watch it happen, is going to call into question the game that he's playing. And I don't know the answer to that. And I guess I'm pessimistic about it.
I really don't have much to add, except I share the pessimism of all three of us. I think some of the things that you were saying about the militarization of the police, I think, is one of the ways in which accountability is being radically unraveled now, and that has a lot to do with the imperial adventures abroad, and that's one of the disturbing things about where impunity is headed in terms of this unraveling.
And what punishment looks like.
And what punishment looks like, yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay, next is Elizabeth, Audie, Anne, and Ling Jen, and that's the people I've left on the queue. Should we take them all at once? I mean, because otherwise it'll take a really long time. Okay, so why don't we do that, and then the speakers can say whatever they wish after hearing the...
Selectively.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, so this is very prosaic. It brings together the two papers. I have been constantly asking if things would have been better if Hillary had been elected, and losing some of my friends in the process. Precisely because, as Joan says, which I loved your formulation of Trumpism as a pseudo-novelty that veils the inevitability of the problem, the excesses of neoliberalism coming home to roost. So had the queen of neoliberalism been elected, then what would have happened? And I guess so. My question is the sort of Clinton version of the Democratic Party in impunity? Is there an impunity being granted to that? Because there is no debate of this sort taking place, except maybe in the back halls of Sanders' apartment or something.
Adi?
I have two questions. I try to be brief. To John, you mentioned several times Trump's base or followers. I wonder, what is this base? How real it is? How material it is? Isn't base a new name for the demos or the multitude or the people or something that replaces the party that comes together in a package with this new kind of rulership? And can we really understand Trump without understanding the constructedness of this base? And maybe this base, this immateriality is the base, is simply the other side of what Akhil just spoke about, the lack of agency, that, or what you said about through Wendy Brown, or what happened to the demos. So I think that both Trump and the base should be thought together, and they should be thought in the context of what produces them. And this is the new media, which was not addressed properly, I think. I mean, you spoke about it, but it has to be, I think, centered, focused. And about impunity, to Zaid, I'm not sure about it, but if we can think about impunity, not strictly in the legal term, but as do harm without cost, as you said before, doing harm without cost, then can't we think about freedom of speech as a domain of impunity? Because what Trump did in this moment when he spoke about shooting someone in the street should have been punished, not at the level of the action, but on the level of the speech act. So, isn't the impunity part of the Constitution?
Anne?
I thought both papers were totally wonderful. Thank you for them. But I kind of wondered whether this cunning. At one point, I think you said, Joan, he never gets exposed. I'm wondering if actually the exposure is absolutely okay, and that the appeal is the cunning, and that there is nothing that's not. That it's the point you made so beautifully, that it's outside the bounds of the true and false. I feel like there's some kind of, and I can't really articulate it, but some kind of different sort of of circumscribed sense in which what can be questioned is much narrower than what could be questioned before. And part of it is almost a historyless world that we're living in. One, and you alluded to it, you both allude to it, that there's a way, it's not deconstruction to me, it's history that is absolutely being refused. And Susan, you got at something about that too. It seemed to me that there is a way in which it's so presentist that it's refusing the military complex, it's refusing an imperialism that is so entrenched, it's refusing a racism that is so entrenched. It's as if they're out of bounds. And it's not just impunity, it's an exemption of certain domains that are absolutely being untouched by the kind of, it's not regime that he has set up, in which those things are not even on the table in the game that he's playing. And they're taken off the table more and more. So what Wendy's, stuff, that's the genealogy of our present, right? And there's something there I felt very strong and very chilling in what you were both arguing. We live in almost a frighteningly historyless world that is being undone.
Okay, Ling Jen, we need a mic down there. Claire, can you pass the mic down? Tim, never mind. Okay.
Hello, hi. I just have first of all, thanks for two wonderful papers. I have a very simple question about impunity. I think it's a wonderful reading by bringing back, deconstruction, and it's fascinating to see how deconstruction today still can help us understand political, contemporary political issues. But this, I think it's this constitutive structural impunity, right? This structural funding violence, right? That is part of almost any systems, right? So I'm wondering how can we avoid, or whether we can avoid like relativism, in the sense that since all systems, right, involve this, founding moment of violence and impunity, how can we even compare? How can we really bring ethical issues to think about a better future? For example, I think the Derridian reading of, the justice, I think there are two justices here. One is legalized within a system. The other one is beyond, the current system. So that big justice is more like a process, right? It's both the possibility and impossibility, right? So who, or which group, or which, first of all, whether that, who can, historically, whether it's a group, whether it's an institution, who can occupy that level of, doing this both ways, right? So that's something I think it's fascinating. It's, rather than just a critical intellectual consciousness. So we all understand it's important to always, to challenge the current system, thinking about its fundamental violence, and injustice within the so-called, legal justice system. But then, in terms of action, not just intellectual awareness, what's the next step even to go beyond? Right? So, for example, if capitalism itself is such a system built on its own impunity, perhaps socialism too, then is there a platform for us even to compare, different systems, and how can we avoid, fundamentally relativism within this kind of a theoretical framework? Yeah.
Sure. I'll start with the last comment. I can't see your name, actually. Oh, okay, Ling. So I think, how can we avoid a fundamental relativism? It seems to me that, first of all, I've surprised myself that I'm turning to Derrida, because I have been cranky about Derrida for a very long time, but I find it very helpful. I think one avoids a fundamental relativism because, in that essay, because he says that the experience of justice is the experience of the impossible. which is a way of giving us an ethical orientation, right? And so it's not as precisely. I don't think relativism is even a danger. His imperative is that you insist that injustice might still be prevailing, even when you think you've delivered justice. That there might be some supplement to the decision that is creating injustice, and so its ongoing practice and approximation has to continue. So then it continues not in the space of a relativism, but in a never quite achieved justice, which is not the same as relativism.
But does that also grant justice to existing systems? Since all systems has this, function.
It's a danger, absolutely, yes. I mean, that's why, I mean, he's interested in the fact that these foundational violences are represented through the very systems that want to secure justice. And so justice is delivered by means of this fundamental paradox, and it may never be delivered. Yes.
So if you could just take a couple of minutes.
Oh, sure, yes. So,
To say anything else?
yes, so, and thank you. I don't have a big response to what you were saying, but I completely agree. I mean, I think that is the danger. I would say that I think that it is, I wouldn't oppose deconstruction in history in quite the way you did, but otherwise, yes, no, I'm completely, I agree. So my response is yes. And what was that? Oh, yes, Elizabeth, I have your notes from your. Oh, yes, freedom, yes. I'll take that first. That's really tough. So Adi, a yes to you as well. I think freedom of speech is one of the domains of impunity, and it actually brings up precisely the problem around the fact that impunity, that one can't always necessarily have an anti-impunity stance, and that stance is not a guarantee either. Because freedom of speech clearly is not being mobilized by, who's that guy? I keep repressing his name. Richard Spencer. Oh yeah, I was thinking of another one, but yes, Yiannopoulos. Yes. Yes. So I think the space of the freedom of speech is the site of the battle and the site of figuring these things out. So I think it's absolutely a space of impunity. I also think to call it that does not conjure that punishment is the solution to it.
Do you think freedom of speech stages the impossible?
Can you say more?
We really do have to end, so I do think our speakers need to say their selective responses, and then
Okay.
we need to take a break
Yes.
to the next session. Thank you.
Okay, and very quickly to Elizabeth's, is impunity being granted by means of neoliberalism? That's sort of where you, and I think absolutely, and I think that I feel like that's a through line through what Joan was saying, what I was saying as well, and I will leave the rest to Joan.
Well, just to pick up on that, I mean, I think what I was trying to say in the talk is that this attempt to coin the notion of Trumpism as a new phenomenon is exactly the granting of impunity to the rest of the Democratic Party and everybody else who are the forces of neoliberalism. And I think, just your question, if Hillary had been elected, what would have happened? Well, in the next round of elections, we would have had the equivalent of Trump. I mean, she would have been the great failure. We would have had a few better Supreme Court justices, and the crisis would not have been resolved, and the attempt to resolve the crisis would have come from some figure like Trump. So, I don't think it would have deferred the crisis without resolving it. I think that Trump's base, I think you're right about the new media producing this new base, and that's why I went to The Apprentice, because I actually think that, and this goes to the question, Anne's question as well, I think it's not just a matter of the cunning guy being admired, but that our cunning, my cunning, leads him to choose me. I mean, I think it's the inversion of the audience, which is, you watch The Apprentice, I think I say it in the paper, it's the production of subjects who not only identify with him, but want to be chosen by him. And choosing him means he's chosen you. So that the cunning, the winning the game, all of that stuff is part of the identification he produces for them with him. And that it's about white people. I think that's where the Ta-Nehisi Coates thing is absolutely right. It's about white people getting to be like him, or to be him, or to be chosen by him, which is the same thing. I think that's all I have to say.
Okay, well, let's thank both Joan and Zahid for a great panel.